Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtual Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your virtual pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency, make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time. So thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. On this members-only episode, we get a bucket load of context that I hope you will appreciate having before moving forward on the public episodes. This one fits nicely between episode 115 and 116, by the way. Now today, Roger receives a visit from a group of Pisans, led by their indispensable admiral. And this admiral had a few things on his mind, namely the suppression of the mighty city of Palermo on Sicily's northwestern coast. Roger is all but offered the second mightiest city in the Western Hemisphere. How will he handle this delegation? Will he take them up on the offer, or will he turn its back? We'll start off with some context before getting in to that particular scene. This is Patreon episode 17, entitled A Pisan Delegation. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the show. So the one thing we have to keep in mind when talking about the modern state of Italy is that the modern state of Italy simply didn't exist before, say, 1946, the best of my ability to figure out. Now, I admittedly don't know the ins and outs of Italian history. What I do know is that our modern conception of Italy is a far cry from what it's been throughout the vast majority of its existence. And it's worth a glance up through the 11th century before we continue so that we can better understand what's happening on the podcast. So, to the best of our knowledge thus far, Italy has been inhabited since as early as, get this, 850,000 years ago by some type of hominid. We have evidence that as late as 50,000 years ago, there existed communities of both Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis. Okay. Is this terribly important to Roger's conquest of Sicily? Of course not. It's not. Sorry. But I think it would be worth our while to stop and appreciate just how ancient the Italian peninsula is when talking about human habitation. From the earliest civilizations on the mainland, as well as those found in the nearby islands of Corsica and Sardinia, we hear mere whispers in the Greek literature from the time. But we know on the mainland that by 2000 BC, the first wave of Indo-Europeans arrived. Then we have the more popular, though still very, very mysterious, Etruscan society that emerged and thrived around 800 BC. And over the next several centuries, the peninsula would see near constant warfare among those small kingdoms that pockmarked the land. In addition to the internecine warfare between the various Latin tribes and communities, the peninsula began to experience external influences pressing in upon them. Eventually, many of these city-states would ally themselves with Carthage and modern-day Tunisia against the mighty Greeks. Now, obviously, Greeks would win out, bringing so much of its culture to the shores and influencing its people beyond measure. Eventually, we will see the rise of the specific city-state situated on the Tiber River across 7 prominent hills. The city was called Rome, and its people, Romans. And these Romans would push out at lightning speed and quickly overtake the central portion of the peninsula. Well, what happens next, I think I can gloss over, as these Romans would create not only a powerful kingdom of Rome, but also a respectable Roman republic that, along with its Greek influences, would directly influence a ragtag group of rebels across the Atlantic Ocean almost 2,000 years later. Oh, and they would also develop into an empire, these Romans, an empire that would fall officially around 450 years later. The Roman Empire would be the largest empire at the time, by far, and wouldn't be eclipsed for another 1,000 years after its fall by those Mongols way out east. It would be the decisions made in Rome that would spur the creation, the suppression, and the establishment of that little desert cult known as Christianity as well. After the Greeks carried on the title of Roman Empire out east in Constantinople, Italy, it seems, at least the peninsula, fell into its own little dark age. It had just suffered terribly from multiple raids over the previous decades leading up to its 457 AD collapse, all at the hands of the migrating Goths, specifically the Ostrogoths. And here's where we wrap up our little history, woefully inadequate as it was for this particular region. See, the peninsula itself, having its eternal empire dismantled within a single lifetime, was left virtually headless. So these Romans began coalescing into smaller communities, effectively devolving back into city-states. Genoa, Venice, Milan, Florence, Pisa, Reggio, Bari, Taranto, Rome, Brindisi, so many more ventured into the tumultuous territory of sovereignty. Over the next few centuries, the Italian peninsula would see influx after influx of Lombards, Germans, and Franks, not to mention the Greek Byzantines grasping for control and largely succeeding across southern Italy and into Sicily. Religiously speaking, Rome had its bishop, but at the time, the Bishop of Rome was, no more powerful than any other major bishop throughout Christendom. The Bishop of Rome was on equal footing with, say, those bishops in Ephesus, Jerusalem, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch. This was soon to change when, on Christmas Day of 800, the Bishop of Rome created his own Roman emperor in direct opposition to the one seated in Constantinople. This, of course, was the famous Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. Now, despite the Holy Roman Empire existing after the year 800, the peninsula still didn't coalesce into anything more unified than a loose coalition of city-states and regions that agreed not to invade. Well, not to invade too much. They still fought, and they still bickered, and they still attempted to usurp control over others' lands. Make no mistake, by the 11th century, the Italian peninsula was just as fractured as ancient Greece or pre-Alfred the Great England. And not only were they fighting amongst themselves, but they were also defending themselves against Byzantine encroachments, as well as Muslim raids launching from the island of Sicily. So by the turn of the millennium, the first millennium, about the time we see the first Normans being approached by that Lombard nobleman looking for allies against the Byzantines, the city of Pisa in Tuscany was enjoying a little mini golden age of its own. In fact, just as Genoa and Venice would be soon enough, it was the Pisans who were the dominant people in northern Italy. And they let everyone know about it too, especially those around Tuscany, including their longtime and future rivals, Florence. But mostly they were a maritime culture, raking in the bountiful trade opportunities from the mainland to Sicily, to Iberia, to North Africa. It was everywhere. But they also sought to capitalize off of their fellow, quote-unquote, Italian communities. In fact, in the year 1005, records indicate a pretty devastating attack on Roger's future home of Reggio in Calabria. This was by the Pisans. In 1016, they joined forces with their rivals, the Genoans, and booted Muslims from the island of Sardinia. It seems the Saracens had gotten a bit too close for comfort. The Pisans were so powerful that they cowed the rival Saracen port cities around Sicily, as well as owned for a brief spell the town of Carthage on the mainland North Africa. They even conquered Corsica in the early 1050s, and in 1060, the Pisans attacked Genoa itself in order to tamp down any gains the Genoans had gotten recently. Pisa was, without question, the single biggest maritime powerhouse in the Western Mediterranean. Well, except for one. And so when they spy the happenings in Sicily by Norman Roger de Hauteville, they wanted to watch it very closely. Again, the Saracens ruling Sicily had been a thorn in their side, an obstacle to their absolute maritime supremacy in the region for well over a century. But now this guy, with his band of backwoods pony boys from up north, were succeeding where even the Byzantines had failed. Well, they waited to see how it all played out. After Messina, they perked up. After Troina, the second time, they began discussing the possibility of using this Count Roger to their advantage. But after Cerami earned the Normans a papal banner, well, it was clear for anyone keeping an eye on things that Count Roger was the real deal. Pisa wasted no time. They launched one of their best fleets with some of their best sailors and leaders and negotiators, and they approached Count Roger in Sicily, no less. As John Julius Norwich in his book The Other Conquest writes, quote, where it sought Roger's cooperation in a combined land and sea attack on Palermo, end quote. With a fleet like the Pisan fleet, Roger could very well have been unstoppable in Sicily. Their ships, his cavalry, it was almost too good to be true. But Roger said no thank you. Now Norwich writes, quote, Roger's reply was disappointing. He had other unfinished business and could take on no further commitments. Later, perhaps, something of the kind might be arranged. For the moment, the Pisans would have to wait. The Pisan admiral argued with him, but it was in vain. Roger merely repeated that he was not ready and that he could not risk his men in such conditions. End quote. And with that, the frustrated admiral left Roger, most likely in quite a huff. Pisa had serious pull in the Western Mediterranean, as I said, and to be snubbed, even respectfully, was like turning your back on the Pope when he said something you didn't like. But the Pisan admiral needed to vent. He needed an outlet of sorts for his anger, so he did what any admiral heading up the largest fleet at the time in the Mediterranean Sea would do, and he sailed on to his original target. He sailed to Palermo. Now, we haven't talked about Palermo much on the podcast at all, really, thus far, so now's probably a great time to do it. Considering how it will play into the rest of not only Roger's conquest of Sicily, but the Middle Ages as a whole. Palermo was actually kind of a big deal. And the reason we here in the West don't know much about it is because for several hundred years, up to this point in the 11th century, Palermo was under Muslim rule. Before that, of course, it had been under the control of everyone, from the Phoenicians and the Romans to the Greeks and the Byzantines. This, of course, is no surprise to us. But something I found surprising was how Palermo and Sicily itself was initially conquered by the North African Muslims. It turns out that the Byzantines, the empire that spent untold blood and coin on trying to reconquer it between the, say, 700s and the 1000s, was actually the very same people who all but handed it over in the first place. Okay, it's not that simple, but it goes something like this. During the great Justinian's efforts, that is, Emperor Justinian of the Eastern Roman Empire, to reestablish firm control over the island back in the 500s, Palermo witnessed arguably the greatest Byzantine general in its 1,000-year-long history, a man named Belisarius. They witnessed him storm its port and to hold it. Between the mid-500s to the year 827, Palermo was Greek, and it served as the westernmost stronghold of the mighty Eastern Roman Empire. From this location, the Eastern Romans would establish the most dominant naval fleet for those 300 or so years. But in that year, the year 827, all of it would come crashing down. That year, one of Eastern Rome's own admirals, a man named Euphemius, betrayed Constantinople for, of course, what else? Personal gain. He invited the Aghlabid Muslims from North Africa into the flourishing port city of Palermo, thus beginning the eventual Muslim conquest of Sicily. Under the Aghlabids, Sicily thrived, actually. They were exceptional stewards of the land, ballooning the already successful agricultural yields of its orchards and vineyards and fields. And they capitalized on its strategically central location, raking in loads of cross-Mediterranean trade. Palermo was quickly made the capital city of what was eventually named the Emirate of Sicily. And Palermo was a stellar capital at that. From Palermo, Muslims spread throughout the mountainous island and grew large cities such as Messina, Agrigento, Enna, Traina, and Syracuse. And as they spread, they made it very clear that though Muslim rule was non-negotiable, religious tolerance was to be the norm, provided, should you not be a Muslim, that you pay a tax. We know from our studies of the Cordoba Caliphate already on the podcast that this was a normal practice among Muslims across the Islamic world. Pay a tax and follow all other rules, and don't get in the way of Islamic practices or talk poorly of it, and you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. Sure, your freedom to practice your religion was somewhat limited, but it was at the very least allowed and tolerated. Thus, Sicily became a home to a, should I say it? A quasi-religious freedom of sorts. I mean, it's nothing like what we in the West would become one day in the far future, but it was a start. Now, by the time Roger was pushing westward across Sicily in the 11th century, Sicily had, as I said, absolutely thrived. It was a culturally integrated and highly successful island. It had been run and protected by some pretty great strategists, some pretty great businessmen, and some pretty exceptional naval minds. But it was also at the time fracturing. And Palermo was home to one of those super influential leaders, one of the emirs on the island. But Palermo was also known as something else too. See, Palermo was the second largest city in the entire European, North African, and Middle Eastern world. Second only to, you guessed it, Constantinople. Paris and London, Aachen, Baghdad, Cairo, Jerusalem, these were, of course, large and influential and growing populations, centers of trade and culture, all the things. But in terms of sheer population size, Palermo stood above all of them. Palermo. Who knew, right? From Palermo, the Muslims would control most of the Mediterranean Sea, certainly the western portion of it. That is, until, as we learned at the top of the show, others started popping onto the scene. Others such as Genoa and Pisa. Thus, we now see why Pisa was so eager to take advantage of the Norman conquest. I'm not even convinced that Pisa wanted the port. I mean, they wouldn't say no to such an expansion, but I can't see the Pisans actively seeking expansion so much as just wanting to be the undisputed ruler of the Western Mediterranean waves. So, back to our narrative here. After the failed negotiations, the Pisan fleet went to Palermo, just to see what they could get out of it. Norwich adds in a footnote in that same book, The Other Conquest, that the Pisa Cathedral, which is still standing today, it had begun its construction in the year 1063, mind you. It has an inscription claiming the Pisans did, in fact, quote, land a small force near the mouth of the Oreto, where they laid waste to villas and gardens in the neighborhood. It also records the capture of 6 Saracen ships, 5 of which, however, they burned, end quote. In addition to this, the Pisans were able to steal the, just kind of find this funny myself, the Pisans were able to steal the actual blockade chain protecting Palermo's great harbor, similar to that one protecting Constantinople's even greater harbor. So the mission wasn't an absolute failure by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly wasn't what the Chronica Pisana, which is the name of the chronicle documenting the golden age of the city-state Pisa at the time. It's not what the Chronica Pisana had said, which explained in some detail that this same fleet actually captured Palermo itself and actually stripped it of its vast treasures, so much so that the Pisa Cathedral could begin its construction in that same year. Yeah, the Chronica Pisana, sorry, never happened. Hate to break it to you, Pisa, but it just didn't. Palermo, even having the sting of your attack in the summer months of 1063, remained firmly in Muslim hands. In fact, life kind of went back to the way it had been, just after a month or two, just a little cleaning up. In fact, it's pretty safe to say that Palermo wasn't even that terribly affected by the attack, short of having to replace their pretty expensive harbor chain. Other than that, yeah, Palermo was doing all right after the Pisan attack of 1063. Now, we're picking up on this and its immediate after effects on the public episode. Again, episode 116. But I wanted to just take a few minutes here and offer a little extra context. I thank you for joining me and for supporting the show. I can't stress how much your support means to the show and to me. Again, thank you. Until next time.